Hello everyone, welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight we bring you 8 of the most unsettling encounters reported by officers working the back roads and isolated hollows of rural Appalachia. For those unfamiliar with this channel, Blacktop Files specializes in long-form true horror from across the United States. We focus on stories that come from real people working real jobs in places most of us only pass through. Tonight's episode centers on law enforcement in the Appalachian region, where officers patrol thousands of square miles of forested mountains, winding two-lane roads, and communities so remote that backup can be an hour away on a good night. These are stories where the thin blue line is stretched across terrain that swallows radio signals, where fog rolls down the ridges thick enough to hide anything, and where the distance between streetlights can measure in miles instead of feet. What makes these accounts particularly disturbing is not just what these officers encountered, but the isolation in which they encountered it. Out here, a single deputy might be responsible for territory that would require a dozen officers in any city precinct. The nearest state trooper could be counties away. Dispatch can hear you, but they can't always help you. And the people who live in these mountains, they have their own ways of handling things, their own silence about what moves through the woods at night. These stories come from men who signed up to protect and serve in some of the most challenging terrain in the country. What they found on those mountain roads wasn't always something they could write up in a report. If you appreciate the work we do here at Blacktop Files, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you know when we post new episodes. We also encourage you to share your own experiences in the comments below. We read every single one, and your encounter might become the basis for a future file. Let's begin with the first account. The sergeant kept asking me why I didn't call it in sooner, and I didn't have an answer that wouldn't make me sound like I'd lost my grip on reality. This was my 3rd year working as a deputy in a county that spreads across 400 square miles of eastern Kentucky mountains. Most of it national forest and private land that hasn't changed hands in generations. I'd grown up 2 counties over, so I understood the territory. I knew how the fog settles in the hollows and doesn't lift until noon. I knew how the roads twist back on themselves and how your GPS will tell you to turn onto logging tracks that haven't been maintained since the 80s. I knew that out here, you handle what you can handle, and you don't make a fuss about things that don't have easy explanations. My shift started at 6 in the evening and ran until 6 in the morning. I covered the northern half of the county, which meant everything from the state route up through the ridgeline communities and down into the hollows on the far side. Most nights, I'd make the loop twice, stopping at the few gas stations still open, checking in with the overnight clerk at the truck stop, running radar on the straight sections where kids like to test their trucks. It was quiet work, the kind where you spend more time looking at trees than people. The first time I saw the truck, it was parked on the shoulder of Route 32, about 2 miles past the turnoff to Guthrie Hollow. It was a late 90s Chevy, dark green, covered in the kind of road salt and mud you'd expect in February. No lights on, no flashers, just sitting there on the gravel shoulder with the front end pointed downhill. I slowed down and hit the spotlight, swept it across the cab. Empty. No one inside. No one standing nearby. The hood wasn't up, and there was no obvious damage to the vehicle. I pulled in behind it, ran the plates. Came back registered to an address in Hazard, about 40 minutes south. No wants, no warrants. I got out and walked up to the driver's side, shined my flashlight through the window. The interior looked clean, no trash, no personal items in the seats. Keys still in the ignition. I tried the door, unlocked. I opened it and leaned in, checked the registration in the glove box. It matched the plate. I looked around the cab for a phone, a wallet, anything that might tell me where the driver had gone. Nothing. I backed out and looked up and down the road. Route 32 runs along the base of the ridge here, with dense forest on both sides. There are no houses for at least a mile in either direction. No trails. No reason someone would just leave their truck and walk off into the woods in the middle of the night in February. I radioed it in. Dispatch took down the information and said they'd try calling the registered owner. I waited by the truck for about 20 minutes, walking the perimeter with my flashlight, checking the tree line. The ground was half frozen, covered in old leaves and patches of snow that hadn't melted from the last storm. I didn't see any footprints leading away from the vehicle. No sign anyone had gotten out and walked anywhere. I checked under the truck, looked for fluid leaks, anything mechanical that might explain an emergency exit. Everything looked fine. Dispatch radioed back. No answer at the owner's number. They'd keep trying. I asked if they wanted me to wait or call a tow. Dispatcher said to wait another 15 minutes and see if anyone showed up. I sat in my cruiser with the heat on, watching the truck in my headlights. The fog was starting to come down off the ridge, that thick Appalachian fog that turns the road into a tunnel and makes your depth perception go strange. I kept the spotlight on the truck. The longer I sat there, the more it bothered me that there were no footprints. The driver had to have gotten out. The keys were in the ignition. The door was unlocked, but there was no trace of anyone leaving. After 15 minutes, I radioed back and told dispatch I was going to have the truck towed to the impound lot in town. They said they'd send someone out. I got out and did one more walk around the vehicle, this time going wider, checking further into the tree line with my flashlight. That's when I saw the other truck. It was about 30 yards into the woods, just far enough back that I hadn't noticed it before. Same make, same model, same color. It was sitting between two trees, facing back toward the road. No plates. I walked over to it, my boots crunching through the frozen underbrush. The truck was older, more rust, but otherwise nearly identical. The driver's door was open. I shined my light inside. The seats were torn up, the dash cracked and faded. There was a smell coming from it, something stale and organic, like old standing water. I checked the ignition. No keys. I checked the registration. Nothing in the glove box. The VIN plate on the dash had been removed. I backed away from it and radioed dispatch. Told them there was a second vehicle in the woods. No plates, no registration, possibly abandoned. Dispatcher acknowledged and said the tow truck was en route. I walked back to the road and waited by my cruiser. The fog was getting heavier. I could barely see 20 feet in either direction now. The green truck on the shoulder sat there in the spotlight, looking perfectly normal, like someone had just pulled over to check their phone and would be back any second. The tow truck arrived about 30 minutes later. I knew the driver, a guy who ran a garage in town and handled most of the county towing. He hooked up the green truck without any trouble and asked me if I wanted him to pull the one in the woods too. I told him I'd have to get approval from the sergeant first, since it wasn't blocking anything and we didn't know if it was actually abandoned or just someone's project vehicle they were storing on private land. He nodded and drove off with the green truck swaying behind him on the flatbed. I stayed there for another 10 minutes, looking at the trees where the second truck was sitting. The fog had swallowed it completely now. I couldn't see it anymore, even with the flashlight. I got back in my cruiser and continued my patrol, making a note to follow up with the sergeant in the morning. The next night, the green truck was back. Same spot, same position, same everything. I pulled up behind it, just after midnight and sat there staring at it in disbelief. I radioed dispatch and asked if the truck had been released from impound. Dispatcher checked and said no, it was still in the lot, waiting for the owner to claim it. I told them I was looking at the same truck, same plates, same location. There was a long pause. Dispatcher asked if I was sure it was the same vehicle. I got out and checked the plate. Same number. I opened the door, same clean interior, same keys in the ignition, same registration in the glove box. I walked back to my cruiser and called the sergeant, directly. He answered on the third ring, sounding like I'd woken him up. I explained the situation. He told me to run the plate again. I did. It came back the same, registered to the same address in Hazard. He told me to wait there. He was coming out. He arrived about 40 minutes later, driving his personal truck. He got out and walked up to the green truck, looked it over with his flashlight. He checked the interior, checked the plate, checked everything I'd already checked. Then he walked into the woods and found the second truck, still sitting there between the trees. He stood there for a long time, just looking at it. When he came back to the road, his face had that expression people get when they're working hard not to show they're disturbed. He told me to get back in my cruiser and follow him. We drove about a mile down Route 32 and turned onto a Forest Service road that cut up into the ridge. We followed it for about 10 minutes, the road getting narrower and rougher until we came to a clearing where the road ended. There were 3 more trucks there, all the same make and model, all dark green, all sitting in various states of decay, covered in moss and rust, surrounded by saplings that had grown up through the wheel wells. The sergeant got out and walked among them, shining his light into each cab. I followed. Every truck was the same. No plates, no registration, no keys, interiors torn up and rotting. The sergeant stopped at the last one and pointed his light at the door panel. There were scratches on the inside, deep gouges in the metal, like someone had tried to claw their way out. We drove back to Route 32 in silence. The green truck was still there on the shoulder, sitting under the fog like it had never been moved. The sergeant told me to call it in as abandoned and have it towed again. He said he'd look into the history of the vehicles, see if there were any reports that matched. He told me not to mention the other trucks to anyone yet, not until he had more information. I had the truck towed for the second time that night. The same driver came out, gave me a strange look, but didn't ask questions. I watched the truck disappear into the fog behind the tow rig and then continued my patrol. The third night, I didn't see the truck. I drove past the spot on Route 32 3 times during my shift, and the shoulder was empty. I felt a strange relief, like maybe the whole thing had resolved itself in some way I didn't need to understand. I didn't go up the Forest Service road. I didn't check the woods for the second truck. I just did my normal loop and tried not to think about it. The fourth night, I got a call about a stranded motorist on Route 32 about 2 miles past the turnoff to Guthrie Hollow. Dispatch said someone had called in from a cell phone, said their truck had broken down and they needed assistance. I acknowledged and headed that way, already knowing what I was going to find. The green truck was back. Same spot. Same position. But this time, there was someone standing next to it. I pulled up behind it and hit the spotlight. The figure was on the driver's side, facing away from me, just standing there. I couldn't tell much about him from the distance, just that he was wearing dark clothes and seemed to be looking into the woods. I got out and approached, my hand on my belt, calling out to identify myself. The figure didn't move. I got closer, within about 10 feet, and that's when I realized something was wrong with the way he was standing. His posture was too stiff. His head was tilted at an angle that didn't look natural. I stopped and called out again, louder this time. The figure turned toward me, and I saw his face in the beam of my flashlight. It was wrong. The proportions were off. The eyes were too far apart. The mouth was too wide. It looked like someone wearing a mask of a human face, but the mask didn't fit right. I stepped back and drew my weapon, ordered him to get on the ground. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing me, with that wrong face catching the light. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady. Dispatch acknowledged. I kept my weapon trained on the figure. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It just stood there next to the truck, like it was waiting for something. I heard the second truck start up in the woods. The engine turned over with a deep rattling sound, and I saw the headlights come on, cutting through the trees. The figure next to the green truck turned and walked into the forest, moving in that same stiff, unnatural way. I didn't follow. I stayed by my cruiser and waited for backup. Watching the headlights move through the trees, getting closer to the road. The backup arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 deputies from the Southern District. By then, the headlights in the woods had gone out, and the figure was gone. The green truck was still there on the shoulder, empty and silent. I told the deputies what I'd seen. They looked at each other, then at me, then walked into the woods with their flashlights. I heard them calling out, heard them moving through the underbrush. They came back about 10 minutes later and said there was nothing there. No second truck, no figure, no sign anyone had been in the woods at all. We stood there on the road, the 3 of us, looking at the green truck. One of the deputies walked up to it and checked the interior. He called out that the keys were in the ignition. I told him not to touch anything. He stepped back and asked me what I wanted to do. I said we'd wait for the sergeant. The sergeant arrived just before dawn. He looked at the truck, looked at me, and told the other deputies they could go. After they left, he got into his truck and motioned for me to follow. We drove back up the Forest Service road to the clearing. The 3 trucks were still there, covered in moss and rust. But now there were 4. The newest one was the green truck, sitting at the end of the seawall, line already starting to decay, saplings growing up around its tires. The sergeant sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the vehicles. Then he got out and walked back to the road, motioning for me to follow. We drove back to Route 32. The shoulder was empty. No green truck. No sign it had ever been there. He told me to finish my shift and come see him in the morning. I did. When I got to his office, he had a file on his desk. He said he'd gone through old reports, talked to some retired deputies, checked accident records going back 30 years. He said there had been a case in the 90s, a man from Hazard who disappeared while driving through the county. His truck was found on the shoulder of Route 32. Keys in the ignition, no sign of the driver. The family had searched for weeks. They'd hired private investigators. They'd organized search parties. They never found him. The truck was released to the family, who sold it at auction. About a year later, another man disappeared the same way, same stretch of road. His truck was found in the same spot, same details, same lack of evidence. It happened 4 more times over the next decade. Always the same make and model truck. Always the same location. Always the same circumstances. The sergeant said the cases were never solved. The official explanation was that the drivers had gotten out of their trucks for some reason and gotten lost in the woods, succumbing to exposure or falling into one of the old mine shafts that honeycombed the ridge. But the families didn't believe it. The locals didn't believe it. And now, the sergeant said, he didn't believe it either.
He asked me if I wanted to request a transfer to the Southern District. I said no. He said he understood, but that I should avoid that stretch of Route 32 during my shifts when possible. He said he'd assign it to the state troopers when they were available. I agreed. I still work the northern half of the county. I still patrol Route 32, but I don't stop for vehicles on the shoulder anymore. Not between the state route and the turnoff to Guthrie Hollow. I drive past and radio it in. Let dispatch send someone else. I've seen the green truck 3 more times over the past 2 years. Always in the same spot, always empty. I don't stop. I don't investigate. I just keep driving. The locals have a name for that stretch of road now. They call it the collection mile. They say the mountain takes a truck every few years, adds it to whatever it's keeping up in those woods. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what I saw that night, standing next to the truck with that wrong face. What I do know is that there are 5 trucks rotting in that clearing now, and I didn't put them there. The next time dispatch calls about a stranded vehicle on that stretch of road, I'll tell them I'm responding, and I'll drive right past it. I stopped doing welfare checks in the holler after what happened at the Pritchard place. This was 5 years ago when I
was still new enough to the department that I'd volunteer for the calls no one else wanted. I was working as a deputy in a county that covers some of the most isolated communities in West Virginia, places where the roads are so narrow and winding that your GPS just gives up and tells you to turn around. Most of the hollers back here don't have names that appear on any map. People just refer to them by the families that have lived there for generations. The Pritchard Holler was one of those places, about 12 miles off the main highway, accessible only by a gravel road that followed a creek bed deeper and deeper into the mountains. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A woman in town said she hadn't heard from her mother in over a week, which wasn't unusual, except that her mother lived alone in the holler and didn't drive. The daughter would normally visit on Sundays, but she'd been sick with the flu and had missed the last 2 weeks. She was worried. She wanted someone to go check on her mother, make sure she was all right. Dispatch sent me because I was the only deputy on duty in that part of the county. I headed out just after noon. The drive took almost 40 minutes, the last half of it on a gravel road that was barely wide enough for one vehicle. The road followed the creek through a narrow valley, with steep wooded slopes rising on both sides. There were a few houses scattered along the way, old clapboard structures with metal roofs and front porches sagging under the weight of decades. Some had smoke coming from their chimneys. Some looked abandoned. It was hard to tell the difference sometimes. The Pritchard place was at the end of the road, where the holler narrowed to the point that the trees on either side almost met overhead. It was a small house, white paint peeling off the wood siding, with a tin roof and a front porch that looked like it had been added on as an afterthought. There was a propane tank in the yard and a wood pile stacked against the side of the house. An old Ford pickup sat in the driveway, covered in pollen and bird droppings, clearly hadn't been driven in a while. I parked behind the truck and got out. The holler was quiet in that particular way that makes you aware of every sound you're making. My boots on the gravel sounded too loud. I walked up to the porch and knocked on the front door, called out to identify myself. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I tried the door, unlocked. I pushed it open and called out again, letting the woman inside know I was coming in to check on her. The interior was dim and smelled like old wood smoke and something else, something faintly sweet and rotten. The front door opened into a small living room with a wood stove in the corner, a couch and a recliner facing an old television set. There were magazines on the coffee table and a Bible on the arm of the recliner. Everything looked neat and undisturbed. I walked through the living room into the wall kitchen, dishes in the sink, a pot on the stove with something dried and crusted inside, a calendar on the wall showing the previous month. I called out again. My voice echoed through the small house. I checked the 2 bedrooms, both empty. Beds made, clothes in the closets. No sign of the woman. I went back to the kitchen and looked out the window at the backyard. There was a garden plot, mostly weeds now, and beyond that the forest rising up the slope. I noticed a trail leading from the back door into the trees. I went outside and followed the trail. It was well worn, the kind of path someone uses regularly. It led about 50 yards into the woods and ended at an old root cellar built into the hillside, the kind of structure people used to use for storing vegetables before refrigeration. The door was a heavy wooden thing with an iron latch. I called out again before I opened it. The smell hit me as soon as the door swung open. It was the same sweet, rotten smell from the house, but much stronger. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it inside. The cellar was about 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with shelves along the walls holding mason jars of preserves and pickled vegetables. The floor was dirt, and in the back corner there was a shape. It was a person, or what was left of one. The body was curled up on the floor, partially covered by a blanket. I couldn't tell immediately if it was the woman I was looking for. The decomposition was significant. I backed out of the cellar and radioed dispatch. Told them I'd found a body and needed the coroner and a detective. Dispatch acknowledged and said they'd send someone. I walked back to the house and waited on the front porch. The holler was still quiet. I could hear the creek running somewhere nearby and the wind moving through the trees. I thought about the daughter in town, how I was going to have to tell her that her mother was dead. I thought about how the body had been in the cellar, covered with a blanket, like someone had put it there deliberately. I wondered if the old woman had died of natural causes and someone had moved her, or if something else had happened. The detective arrived about an hour later, along with the coroner and another deputy. We went back to the cellar together. The detective took photographs and examined the scene while the coroner did a preliminary assessment. The body was definitely the woman we were looking for. The coroner said she'd been dead for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. The cause of death wasn't immediately clear, but there were no obvious signs of violence. The detective asked me if I'd found anything unusual in the house. I told him about the unlocked door, the dishes in the sink, the calendar showing the wrong month. He nodded and said he'd do a more thorough search. We spent the next 2 hours going through the house, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. We found medical bills indicating the woman had been sick, some kind of heart condition. We found a note on the kitchen table, written in shaky handwriting, that said she was going out to the cellar to get some jars and would be back soon. The detective theorized that she'd gone out to the cellar, had some kind of medical emergency, and collapsed before she could get back to the house. Someone had found her and covered her with the blanket, but hadn't reported it. The question was who. We went door to door in the holler, talking to the neighbors. Most of them were elderly, related to the Pritchards in some way, generations of cousins and in-laws living within a few miles of each other. They all said they hadn't seen the old woman in weeks. They all said they hadn't been up to her place. They all said they didn't know anything about the body in the cellar, but there was something in the way they said it, a kind of deliberate blankness in their expressions that made it clear they were lying. The detective pressed them. He said someone must have known. Someone must have checked on her. Someone must have found the body and put the blanket over it. The neighbors just shook their heads and said they didn't know. One old man, sitting on his porch with a shotgun across his lap, said that people in the holler take care of their own. He said we wouldn't understand. We went back to the Pritchard place as the sun was starting to set. The detective said he was going to have the body removed and send it for an autopsy, but he didn't think we'd find anything criminal. He said it looked like natural causes, complicated by isolation and family dynamics he didn't want to get into. He told me to file my report and move on. I did. I wrote up the welfare check, the discovery of the body, the interviews with the neighbors. I filed it and went back to my regular patrols. But the whole thing bothered me. The way the body had been arranged in the cellar. The way the neighbors had responded. The way that old man had said we wouldn't understand. About a month later, I got another call. Different holler, same county, another welfare check. An elderly man living alone. Family hadn't heard from him in 2 weeks. I drove out there, another long gravel road, another narrow valley, another house at the end of the road. Same routine, knocked on the door. No answer. Door unlocked. Inside, everything neat and undisturbed. Checked the bedrooms. Checked the kitchen. Checked the backyard. There was a trail leading into the woods. I followed it. It led to another root cellar built into the hillside. I opened the door. Same smell. Same scene. Body in the back corner, covered with a blanket, decomposed. Clearly been there for weeks. I radioed it in. The same detective responded. We went through the same process. Coroner photographs, interviews with neighbors. Same results. No one knew anything. No one had seen anything. No one had been to the house. But someone had found the body and covered it with a blanket. The detective asked me if I was seeing a pattern. I said yes. He said he'd done some asking around, talked to some of the older deputies who'd been working the county for decades. He said this was something that happened sometimes in the hollers, especially with elderly people who lived alone. When someone died, the family would find them, but they wouldn't report it right away. They'd cover the body, leave it somewhere cool like a cellar or a spring house, and wait. Sometimes they'd wait weeks or even months before calling it in. It was an old tradition, something about not wanting outsiders involved, not wanting the state or the county making decisions about what happened to their family members. I asked him if it was legal. He said no, but it wasn't really something they prosecuted. The people were dead of natural causes. The families were grieving in their own way. It didn't hurt anyone, technically. It was just the way things were done back in these hollers, and trying to change it would cause more problems than it solved. I did 3 more welfare checks that year. All of them ended the same way. Body in a cellar or a spring house, covered with a blanket. Family claiming they didn't know anything. After the 3rd one, I told dispatch I wasn't doing welfare checks anymore. They asked why. I said it wasn't a good use of resources. They said fine and started sending other deputies. But here's the thing that still bothers me. The thing I couldn't put in my report. On that last welfare check, when I found the body in the spring house, there was something different about the blanket. It had embroidery on it, the kind of detailed needlework that takes months to complete. It was a pattern of trees and mountains and a creek running through a valley, and in the corner, stitched in careful letters, were the words, "The holler takes care of its own." I stood there, looking at that blanket for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. The body under it had been dead for at least a month. The blanket was clean and new, the embroidery fresh. Someone had made it specifically for this purpose, specifically to cover this body, and had done so, knowing that eventually Someone like me would find it and see the message. I told the detective about the blanket. He looked at it and shrugged. He said it was probably just something the family had made, a way of honoring their dead. He said not to read too much into it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few weeks later, I was patrolling the main highway and saw an old woman walking along the shoulder carrying a basket. I recognized her from one of the haulers, one of the neighbors I'd interviewed. I pulled over and asked if she needed a ride. She said no, she was just walking to town to buy some thread. I asked her what she was making. She smiled and said she was making a blanket for her husband. I asked if he was sick. She said no, not yet, but he would be soon. Everyone gets sick eventually. Everyone needs a blanket eventually. I drove away and didn't look back. I stopped taking calls in the hollers altogether after that. I told dispatch I was focusing on highway patrol and town coverage. They didn't argue. There were other deputies willing to go into the hollers, deputies who'd grown up in those communities and understood the way things worked back there. I still drive past the turnoffs to those gravel roads sometimes during my shifts. I see the names people have given them, family names that go back generations. I think about the cellars and spring houses hidden in the woods, about the blankets with their careful embroidery, about the old woman walking to town to buy thread. I think about what it means to say the holler takes care of its own, and whether that's comforting or terrifying. I drive past and I don't turn in. That's someone else's job now. The footprints in the parking lot started showing up the same week they assigned me to the overnight shift at the outpost. I'd been working as a state trooper for about 6 years at that point, mostly highway patrol during the day, but they needed someone to cover nights at the small satellite office we maintained in the northern part of the county. It was just a single-wide trailer, sitting on a gravel lot about halfway between two small towns, positioned at the intersection of a state route and a county road. The idea was to have a visible presence in an area that was otherwise pretty isolated. Give people a place to report things without having to drive all the way to the main barracks 40 miles south. The outpost consisted of a small office area with a desk and a radio console, a tiny break room with a microwave and a coffee maker and a bathroom. There were security lights mounted on poles at each corner of the lot, bright enough to illuminate the entire area and the first 20 feet of the tree line that surrounded it on 3 sides. The 4th side was the road. It wasn't a comfortable place to spend 12 hours, but it wasn't terrible either. I could do paperwork, monitor the radio, respond to calls in the area, and take reports from anyone who stopped by. The first night was quiet. I arrived at 8 in the evening, relieving the day shift trooper who looked grateful to be leaving. He told me the coffee maker was broken and the heat was temperamental, but otherwise everything was fine. I settled in, made my first patrol loop around the area, came back to the outpost around midnight, and spent the rest of the shift catching up on reports. I left at 8 in the morning when my relief arrived, drove home, and slept through the day. The second night was when I noticed the footprints. I pulled into the lot around 8, parked in my usual spot near the door, and got out to unlock the trailer. That's when I saw them. Boot prints in the gravel, leading from the tree line on the east side of the lot to the front door of the trailer, then back to the tree line. They were clear and fresh, pressed deep into the gravel like whoever made them had been walking slowly and deliberately. I followed them with my flashlight, seeing where they emerged from the woods, crossed the lot, went right up to the door, then turned around and went straight back into the trees. I checked the door. No signs of forced entry. The lock was intact. I went inside and looked around, nothing disturbed, nothing missing, everything exactly as I'd left it that morning. I went back outside and followed the prints to the edge of the lot, where they disappeared into the underbrush. I shined my light into the woods, but couldn't see anything, just trees and darkness. I radioed the day shift trooper and asked if anyone had stopped by during his shift. He said no, it had been completely dead, no visitors at all. I told him about the footprints. He said it was probably just someone from one of the nearby houses, maybe checking to see if anyone was there, or maybe someone who needed help, but left when they realized the office was closed. I said that made sense and let it go, but the footprints came back. Every night that week, I'd arrive at 8 and find the same pattern. Boot prints from the tree line to the door and back, always from the same direction, always the same depth, always stopping right at the door, then turning around and going straight back to the woods. I started arriving earlier, around 7:30, thinking maybe I could catch whoever it was, but the prints were always there when I arrived, like they'd been made hours earlier. I asked around town during my patrol loops. Nobody knew anything about it. The nearest houses were about half a mile away, and the people who lived there were mostly elderly or families with small children. Nobody who'd have reason to be walking through the woods at night to visit an empty office. I checked with the county sheriff's department, asked if they'd had any reports of someone wandering around at night. Nothing. The footprints kept appearing, same pattern, same location, every single night. I started documenting them, taking photographs, measuring the stride length, noting the tread pattern. They belonged to work boots, probably size 10 or 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. I sent the photos to the barracks and asked if anyone recognized the pattern. Nobody did. After 2 weeks of this, I decided to wait and see if I could spot whoever was making the prints. I arrived at the outpost at 6 in the evening, 2 hours before my shift, and parked my cruiser down the road where it wouldn't be visible from the lot. I walked back through the woods, positioned myself in the tree line on the west side, where I had a clear view of the entire lot, and waited. The security lights came on at dusk, flooding the gravel with harsh white light. I sat there in the woods, watching, my radio turned down low. The night got darker, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air. Nothing moved in the lot. No cars passed on the road. No sounds except the wind, in the trees and the occasional creak of the trailer settling. Around 10 o'clock, I saw the footprints appear. I don't mean I saw someone making them. I mean I watched the footprints form in the gravel, one after another, crossing the lot from the east side toward the trailer. There was no one there, no visible person, no shadow, no disturbance in the air, just the prints appearing in sequence, pressed deep into the gravel, moving at a steady walking pace. I watched them cross the entire lot, maybe 40 feet, each print appearing as if an invisible boot was stepping down and lifting up. They reached the door of the trailer and stopped. I waited, holding my breath. After about 30 seconds, the prints turned and started walking back, retracing the path toward the tree line. They reached the edge of the lot and stopped at the exact spot where they'd started. I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or my eyes adjusting to the dark, or something about the way the gravel reflected the security lights. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation, but I couldn't think of one that made sense. I waited another hour, but nothing else happened. The footprints just sat there in the gravel, clear and visible in the light. Eventually, I walked back to my cruiser, drove to the outpost, and started my shift. I didn't mention what I'd seen in my log. I didn't tell my relief when he arrived in the morning. I just went home and tried to sleep, but I kept seeing those prints forming in the gravel one after another, with nothing there to make them. The next night, I brought a game camera, the kind hunters use to photograph deer. I mounted it on a tree at the edge of the lot, positioned to capture the area where the footprints always appeared. I set it to take a photo every time it detected motion. Then I went into the trailer and tried to do my normal shift. I couldn't concentrate. I kept going outside every hour to check the lot. The footprints hadn't appeared yet. Around midnight, I went out for another check and they were there, same as always. I went straight to the camera. It had taken 43 photos. I pulled the memory card and looked at the images on my laptop. 43 photos of an empty lot. The timestamps showed the photos were taken in sequence over about 5 minutes. The angle and lighting were perfect. I could see the gravel clearly in every shot, but there was nothing in the images. No person, no animal, no disturbance of any kind. The footprints weren't even visible in the photos, even though I could walk outside right now and see them clearly in the gravel. I went back outside and looked at the prints, then at the camera, then at the prints again. They were right there, undeniable, pressed deep into the gravel, but the camera hadn't captured them forming, hadn't captured anything at all. I left the camera up for a week, checking it every night. Same results. Dozens of photos of an empty lot. No evidence of anything unusual. But every night, the footprints appeared, always the same pattern, always the same path. I started asking older troopers about the outpost, guys who'd been with the department for 20 or 30 years. Most of them had spent time there at some point. One of them, a sergeant about 2 years from retirement, asked me if I'd seen the footprints yet. I said yes. He nodded like he'd expected it. He said the footprints had been appearing since the outpost was established, almost 15 years ago. Every trooper who'd worked the overnight shift had seen them. Nobody knew what caused them. Nobody had ever caught anyone making them. They'd tried everything: cameras, motion sensors, stakeouts. Nothing worked. The prints just appeared. I asked him what he thought they were. He said he didn't know, but he had a theory. About 20 years ago, before the outpost was there, a man had been found dead on that stretch of road. He'd been walking at night, probably trying to get to town after his car broke down, and he'd been hit by a truck. The driver never stopped. The man's body was found the next morning, about 50 feet from where the outpost sits now. The investigation went cold. They never found the truck or the driver. The sergeant said some of the older troopers believed the footprints were the man walking to where the outpost is now, looking for help that never came. He said he didn't know if that was true, but it was the only explanation anyone had offered that seemed to fit. I asked him if he believed it. He said it didn't matter what he believed. The footprints were real. Troopers had been seeing them for 15 years. Whether they were made by a ghost or some weird atmospheric phenomenon or something else entirely, they weren't hurting anyone. They just appeared every night, walked to the door and walked back. The sergeant said the best thing to do was acknowledge them and move on. I worked that shift for 8 months. The footprints appeared every single night, without fail. I stopped investigating them after the first month. I stopped photographing them. I stopped checking the tree line with my flashlight. I just accepted them as part of the routine, like the broken coffee maker and the temperamental heat. When I arrived at 8, the prints were there. When I left at 8 in the morning, they were still there, slowly fading as the day shift trooper drove over them or the wind scattered the gravel. I got transferred to a different district after those 8 months, moved to a post that was closer to my house and had better hours.
I was relieved to leave the outpost, not because of the footprints specifically, but because the whole place had a weight to it that I couldn't explain. The isolation, the darkness, the trees pressing in from all sides. The footprints were just part of that weight. I heard later that they assigned a new trooper to the overnight
shift at the outpost. I don't know if he's seen the footprints. I don't know if anyone told him about them. I never mentioned them in my reports or my exit interview. What would I say? That every night for 8 months, invisible boot prints appeared in the gravel and walked to the door of the trailer. That I'd watched them form with my own eyes and couldn't explain it. I still drive past that intersection sometimes when I'm patrolling the northern part of my new district. I can see the outpost from the road, the trailer sitting in its gravel lot, the security lights bright against the dark tree line. I don't stop. I don't slow down. I just drive past and keep going. Whoever's working that shift now can deal with the footprints. They'll figure out their own way of living with it, just like I did. Sometimes, late at night when I'm on patrol, I think about the man who was hit by the truck 20 years ago. I think about him walking along that dark road, trying to get to town, hoping someone would stop and help him. I think about how no one did, how he died alone on the roadside and was found the next morning by a passing motorist. I think about the footprints walking from the tree line to the door of the outpost, stopping there, then turning back. Always stopping at the door, never going inside. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything. But I know those footprints are still there, appearing every night, and they'll be there long after I retire. The dispatcher kept insisting I needed to go inside the house, and I kept telling her I wasn't doing that without backup. This was 3 years ago, late November, one of those nights where the temperature drops below freezing, and the fog settles into the valleys so thick you can barely see the hood of your cruiser. I was working as a deputy in a county that covers about 300 square miles of Virginia mountains, mostly forest and farmland with a few small towns scattered along the main highway. My shift was 8 in the evening to 8 in the morning, and I was the only deputy covering the Western District that night. The call came in around 2 in the morning. A woman had called 911 from a landline, said there was someone in her house, and then the line went dead. Dispatch tried calling back, but no one answered. The address was a farmhouse about 8 miles off the main highway, up a winding road that followed a creek into a narrow valley. I knew the area. It was remote, the kind of place where your nearest neighbor is a mile away and the road doesn't get plowed until days after a storm. I radioed that I was responding and started the drive. The fog was so thick that I had to slow down to about 20 miles an hour, following the center line and hoping no one was coming the other way. The road climbed steadily, passing a few darkened houses and trailers, then narrowed to a single lane that hugged the creek. I could hear the water rushing beside the road, swollen from recent rain. The farmhouse sat on a piece of flat land where the valley widened slightly. It was an old 2-story structure with white siding and a metal roof, surrounded by a few outbuildings and a barn that looked like it was close to collapsing. There was a light on in one of the upstairs windows. A car was parked in the driveway, a sedan covered in the same fog dampness as everything else. I pulled in behind it and radioed my arrival. I got out and approached the house, my flashlight in one hand and my other hand on my belt. The front porch was small, just a couple of steps up to a door with a window in the top half. I knocked and called out, identifying myself. No response. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I tried the door. Locked. I walked around to the back of the house, checking windows and doors. Everything was secure. The light in the upstairs window was still on, but I couldn't see any movement inside. I radioed dispatch and told them the situation. They confirmed the call had come from this address, from a landline registered to a woman in her 60s who lived alone. Dispatch said they tried calling several more times with no answer. They asked if I could see anything suspicious. I said no, just a locked house with a light on upstairs. They asked if I could make entry to do a welfare check. I said not without backup or a clear indication of an emergency. Dispatch said the woman had specifically said someone was in her house. That counted as an emergency. I said I understood, but I wanted another unit before I went inside. Dispatch said the nearest unit was at least 30 minutes away. They asked if I could at least try to make contact with the woman, maybe call out from under the window. I walked back to the front of the house and stood in the yard, looking up at the lit window. I called out, loud enough for anyone inside to hear, identifying myself and asking if anyone needed help. No response. I called out again. Nothing. The house just sat there in the fog, silent and still. I decided to check the outbuildings while I waited for backup. I walked over to the barn first, a sagging structure with gaps in the walls and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. I pushed the door open and shined my flashlight inside. Empty. Just some old hay bales and rusted farm equipment. I checked a smaller shed next to the barn. Also empty. There was a third building, a garage-sized structure with a roll-up door. I tried the door, locked. I walked around it, checking for windows or another entrance. Nothing. I went back to the house and stood on the front porch debating what to do. The light in the upstairs window flickered. I watched it for a moment. It flickered again, like someone had walked past it. I radioed dispatch and told them I saw movement in the upstairs window. They said that was probable cause to make entry. I said I still wanted to wait for backup. They said the other unit was still 20 minutes out and I needed to assess the situation now. I tried the front door again, this time putting my shoulder into it. It didn't budge. The door was solid wood, the lock old but sturdy. I didn't want to break it down, not without a better reason. I walked around to the back again and tried the back door. Same result. I checked all the first floor windows. All locked. I went back to the front and stood there, looking up at that lit window, trying to decide. That's when I heard the scream. It was faint, coming from inside the house, high-pitched and short, like someone had been startled or hurt. I radioed dispatch and told them I was making entry. I went back to the back door and kicked it in. The frame splintered and the door swung open. I drew my weapon and went inside. The back door opened into a kitchen. It was clean and neat. Dishes in the drainer, a table with a newspaper folded on it. I moved through the kitchen into a hallway that led to the front of the house. There was a living room on one side, a dining room on the other, both empty. I called out, identifying myself, saying I was there to help. No response. I found the stairs and started climbing, my flashlight and weapon sweeping ahead of me. The stairs were narrow and creaked under my weight. I moved slowly, checking each step. At the top was a landing with 4 doors, all closed. The light was coming from under one of them, the second door on the left. I approached it and called out again. No response. I tried the handle. Locked. I called out one more time, then kicked the door open. The room was a bedroom, small and plainly furnished. There was a bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a lamp. That was the source of the light. The window looked out over the front yard. The room was empty. I checked the closet. Empty. I checked under the bed. Nothing. I backed out of the room and checked the other 3 rooms. A bathroom, a second bedroom, and a small office. All empty. No one in the house. I went back downstairs and did a more thorough search, checking closets, behind furniture, anywhere someone could hide. Nothing. The house was empty. I radioed dispatch and told them there was no one here. They asked about the 911 call. I said I didn't know, but the house was secure and there was no sign of an intruder or the woman who lived here. Dispatch said to wait for backup and they'd figure it out. I went back outside and stood in the yard looking at the house. The light in the upstairs window was still on. I walked back to my cruiser and waited, the fog pressing in around me, muffling all sound except the creak. The backup arrived about 15 minutes later, another deputy from the Eastern District. We went through the house together, room by room, checking everything again. Same results. No one there. No signs of a struggle. No indication anyone had been in the house recently, except for the broken back door, which I'd done. We went outside and checked the outbuildings again. Still nothing. We walked the perimeter of the property, looking for footprints or any signs someone had left in a hurry. The ground was too hard and the fog too thick to see much, but we didn't find anything obvious. The other deputy radioed dispatch and asked for the woman's phone number. Dispatch provided it and he called. It rang inside the house. We went back in and followed the sound to the kitchen, where a landline phone was mounted on the wall. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He left a message asking the woman to call the sheriff's department as soon as possible. We stood in the kitchen trying to piece together what had happened. The woman calls 911, says there's someone in her house, the line goes dead. We arrive and find the house empty and locked up. No sign of forced entry except what I did. No sign of the woman. Her car is still here. Where did she go? The other deputy suggested maybe she left with someone, a friend or family member, and forgot to mention it when she called 911. Maybe she'd been confused or frightened by something that turned out to be nothing. I said maybe, but it didn't explain why she didn't answer when we called out, or why she didn't come to the door. We decided to leave a note on the front door asking her to contact us, and we'd follow up in the morning. We secured the back door as best we could, given that I'd kicked it in and left. I drove back to the main highway and continued my patrol, but I couldn't stop thinking about that empty house and the light in the upstairs window. The next day, I got a call from the sergeant. He said the woman had been found. She was staying with her daughter in town, about 20 miles away. She'd driven there 2 days ago and had been there ever since. She hadn't called 911. She hadn't been at the house at all. Her daughter confirmed it. I asked about the 911 call. The sergeant said they were looking into it. The call had definitely come from the woman's landline, but she insisted she hadn't made it. Someone had used her phone either while she was still at the house 2 days ago, or someone had gotten into the house afterward. But there was no sign of forced entry, and the woman said she'd locked everything up before she left. The sergeant asked if I'd noticed anything else unusual at the house. I told him about the light in the upstairs window, the flickering, the scream I thought I'd heard. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if I was sure about the scream. I said yes. That's why I'd made entry. He said the woman's daughter mentioned that her mother had been hearing things in the house for the past few months. Voices and footsteps, doors closing on their own. The daughter thought it was just her mother getting older, maybe some early signs of dementia, and that's why she convinced her to stay in town for a while. I asked what we were supposed to do about the house. The sergeant said the woman had given permission for us to check it again, make sure everything was secure. He asked if I could go back out there during my shift and do a walkthrough. I said yes. I went back that night around the same time as before. The fog was just as thick, the road just as difficult to navigate. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, looking at the house. The light in the upstairs window was off now. The whole house was dark. I got out and walked to the front door. The note we'd left was gone. I tried the door, still locked. I walked around to the back. The door I'd kicked in had been repaired. New wood screwed over the damaged frame. Someone had fixed it since we'd left. I radioed dispatch and asked if anyone had been authorized to make repairs at the house. They checked and said no. I asked if the woman or her daughter had mentioned anything about going to the house. They said no, both of them were still in town. I stood there in the backyard looking at the repaired door, trying to figure out what was going on. I tried the door, locked. I walked back to the front and used my flashlight to look through the windows. Everything inside looked the same as before. I decided to call the sergeant. He answered after a few rings. I explained the situation. He said he'd call the woman and find out if she'd sent someone to fix the door. He told me to wait there. I stood in the front yard, the fog swirling around me, and waited. He called back about 10 minutes later. The woman said she hadn't sent anyone. She hadn't even known the door was broken. The sergeant asked if I wanted him to send another unit. I said yes. He said it would be about an hour. I went back to my cruiser and waited, watching the house. After about 20 minutes, the light in the upstairs window came on. I got out and approached the house, calling out. No response. I went to the back door and tried it, still locked. I went back to the front and looked up at the window. The light flickered, just like before. I radioed dispatch and told them what was happening. They asked if I wanted to make entry. I said not until backup arrived. They acknowledged. The light in the window stayed on. I stood in the yard watching it, my hand on my belt. After about 10 minutes, I saw movement behind the window. A shadow like someone walking past. Then the shadow stopped and I saw a face looking down at me. It was pale and indistinct, but I could make out the shape of eyes and a mouth. It stared down at me for several seconds, then disappeared. I drew my weapon and ran to the back door, kicked it in again. The repaired wood splintered and the door flew open. I went inside, moving through the kitchen and into the hallway. I could hear footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor. I called out, identifying myself. The footsteps stopped. I climbed the stairs, my flashlight and weapon leading the way. I reached the landing and saw that the door to the lit bedroom was open. I approached slowly, checking the other rooms as I passed. All empty. I reached the open door and looked inside. The room was empty. The lamp on the nightstand was on, but there was no one there. I checked the closet, under the bed, everywhere. Nothing. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard, trying to understand what I'd seen. The face in the window had been real. The footsteps had been real. But there was no one here. I heard the back door close downstairs. I ran down the stairs and into the kitchen. The door I'd kicked in was closed, the broken wood lying on the floor beside it. I opened the door and looked outside. The yard was empty. I checked the outbuildings, the barn, the shed, the garage, nothing. Backup arrived about 30 minutes later. We went through the house again, top to bottom. We found nothing, no one hiding, no signs of anyone having been there, except the broken back door and the light that was on in the upstairs bedroom. The sergeant came out the next morning. We walked through the house with him, showed him everything. He talked to the woman on the phone, asked if she wanted us to arrange for someone to stay at the house, or change the locks or anything like that. She said no. She said she didn't want to go back. She was going to sell it. I asked the sergeant what he thought had happened. He said he didn't know, but he'd heard stories about that house over the years. Other deputies had responded to calls there, going back a decade or more. Always the same pattern. Someone calling 911, saying there was an intruder, then no one being there when deputies arrived. He said the woman who lived there before the current one had reported the same thing. Voices, footsteps, lights turning on and off. She'd eventually moved out too. I asked if anyone had ever figured out what was causing it. He said no. Some people thought it was wiring problems. Old houses with electrical issues that caused lights to flicker and created sounds that seemed like footsteps. Some people thought it was the wind, the way these mountain valleys channel air through old structures and create strange noises. And some people thought it was something else, something no one wanted to talk about. I transferred to the Eastern District about a year later. I don't patrol that area anymore. I heard the house sold, but I don't know who bought it or if they're still there. I drive past the turnoff to that road sometimes, late at night when the fog is thick, and I think about the light in the upstairs window and the face looking down at me. I think about the footsteps and the repaired door and the way the house just sat there in the fog, silent and waiting. I don't stop. I just keep driving. The thing I found in the back of the pickup stayed with me longer than anything else I've encountered in 12 years of patrol. I was working as a deputy in a county that covers some of the most isolated stretches of eastern Tennessee, where the roads wind through national forest for miles without passing a single house. My shift was 4 in the afternoon to 4 in the morning, and most of those hours were spent driving long loops through territory where cell service cuts in and out, and your radio is your only connection to anything resembling civilization. It was early March, that time of year, when the weather can't decide what it wants to be. The afternoon had been warm, almost spring-like, but by the time the sun went down, the temperature had dropped into the 30s and a cold rain had started falling. I was on Route 421, a 2-lane road that follows the ridgeline for about 30 miles, before dropping down into the valley where the county seat is located. Traffic was light, mostly locals heading home from work, a few trucks hauling timber. Around 10 o'clock, I came around a curve and saw a pickup truck pulled off on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. It was an older model Ford, dark blue, sitting at an angle like the driver had pulled over in a hurry. I slowed down and pulled in behind it, activating my lights. I ran the plate before I got out. It came back registered to an address in Kingsport, about 60 miles northeast. No wants or warrants. I got out and approached the driver's side. The window was down and a man was sitting behind the wheel, both hands visible on the steering wheel. He was in his 50s, wearing a work jacket and a ball cap, with the kind of weathered face you get from spending most of your life outdoors. I asked if everything was all right. He said he'd pulled over because he thought he'd heard something in the bed of his truck, like something was moving around back there. He said it had been going on for the last 10 miles and it was making him nervous. I asked if he was hauling anything. He said no, the bed was empty. He'd been down in Chattanooga visiting his brother and was heading home. I asked if I could take a look. He said yes, please, because he wasn't getting back on the road until he knew what was making that noise. I walked around to the back of the truck and shined my flashlight into the bed. It was empty, like he'd said, just bare metal with some rust and a few leaves that had blown in. I checked the corners, looking for anything that might be loose and rattling around. Nothing. I tapped on the sides of the bed, checking for loose panels. Everything seemed solid. I walked back to the driver's window and told him I didn't see anything. He said the noise had stopped when he pulled over, but it had definitely been there while he was driving. He described it as a scraping sound, like something metallic dragging across the bed. I suggested maybe it was something in the wheel wells, maybe a stone or a piece of debris caught in there. He said maybe, but he didn't sound convinced. I told him to wait a minute and went back to the bed of the truck. I climbed up on the bumper and leaned over, using my flashlight to check the wheel wells from above. That's when I saw it. There was something wedged between the bed and the cab in the narrow gap where they meet. It was dark and rectangular, about the size of a shoebox. I reached down and pulled it out. It was a metal box, old and heavily rusted, with a latch that looked like it had been welded shut at some point and then pried open. The box was heavy, heavier than it should have been for its size. I climbed down and carried it to the driver's window, asked the man if it was his. He leaned out and looked at it, then shook his head. He said he'd never seen it before. He said there was no way it could have been in his truck when he left Chattanooga, because he'd checked the bed before he loaded his toolbox, and there'd been nothing there. I set the box on the hood and examined it more closely. The metal was corroded almost all the way through in some places, like it had been buried or left outside for years. The latch had definitely been forced open recently. The metal around it was bright where it had been pried. I tried to open it, but the lid was stuck. I went back to my cruiser and got a pry bar from the trunk. I wedged the bar under the lid and applied pressure. The lid resisted for a moment, then popped open with a sound like tearing metal. Inside was a cloth bundle, wrapped in what looked like an old piece of canvas. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside were bones. They were small, definitely not human. They looked like animal bones, maybe from a dog or a large cat. They'd been arranged deliberately, laid out in a pattern that didn't make sense anatomically. The skull was in the center, surrounded by the leg bones, with the ribs and vertebrae arranged in a circle around them. There was something else in the box too, underneath the bones. I lifted the skull and saw a piece of paper, folded and yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully. It was covered in handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. The words didn't make sense. They looked like English, but the sentences were nonsense. Strings of words that didn't form coherent thoughts. At the bottom of the page was a date, October 1987. I looked up at the driver. He was staring at the box with an expression I couldn't quite read. I asked him again if he knew anything about it. He said no, and he said it in a way that made it clear he didn't want to know anything about it. He asked if he could go. I told him to wait a minute. I took the box back to my cruiser and radioed dispatch. Told them what I'd found. Dispatch asked if the bones looked human. I said no, definitely animal. They asked if there was anything else in the box. I described the paper with the writing. There was a pause, then the dispatcher asked me to read some of the text. I did. Another pause. The dispatcher said to bring the box in and they'd have someone look at it. I went back to the driver and told him he was free to go, but I needed his contact information in case we had follow-up questions. He gave me his name and phone number, then asked what I was going to do with the box. I said I was taking it to the station. He said good, he didn't want anything to do with it. He started the truck and drove off, faster than he probably should have on that winding road. I put the box in the trunk of my cruiser and continued my patrol. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The bones, the way they'd been arranged, the paper with its nonsensical writing, the date, 1987, more than 30 years ago. How had the box ended up in the back of that man's truck? And why had it been making noise? I finished my patrol loop and headed back to the station around 2 in the morning. I brought the box inside and set it on the desk. The night dispatcher took a look at it, read the paper, and said he'd never seen anything like it. He said he'd leave it for the detective to look at in the morning. I went home and tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about the box. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. The man had said he'd checked the bed of his truck before he left Chattanooga, and it had been empty. He'd said the noise started about 10 miles before he pulled over. That would have been right around the time he'd passed through a section of the forest where there's an old cemetery, one of those family plots that date back to the 1800s. I'd seen it dozens of times, a small cleared area on the side of the road with a rusted fence and a few leaning headstones. The next day, I called the detective and asked if he'd looked at the box. He said he had. He said the bones were from a dog, arranged in what looked like some kind of ritual pattern. The paper was more interesting. He'd shown it to a professor at the university who specialized in folklore and local history. The professor said the writing was consistent with certain Appalachian folk magic practices from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, specifically practices related to protection or warding. The date suggested someone had placed the box there in 1987, possibly as part of a ritual or ceremony. I asked if the detective had any idea how it ended up in the back of that man's truck. He said no. He'd called the man and asked him some follow-up questions, but the man insisted he had no knowledge of the box and no connection to the area where he'd pulled over. The detective said it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe the box had fallen off another vehicle and landed in the man's truck bed, or maybe someone had thrown it in there as a prank. I didn't buy it. The box had been wedged between the bed and the cab, not just sitting loose. And the man had described a scraping sound like something moving on its own. I asked the detective if I could go back out to the area where the man had pulled over, maybe look around and see if there was anything else. He said sure, but he didn't think I'd find anything. I drove out there that afternoon, parked on the shoulder where the man had been, and walked up and down the road for about a quarter mile in each direction. I didn't see anything unusual. I walked into the woods on both sides, looking for signs that someone had been there recently. Nothing. I drove past the old cemetery, pulled over, and walked among the headstones. Most of them were so weathered I couldn't read the names. A few were legible, dates from the 1800s, family names I didn't recognize. I was about to leave when I noticed something near the back of the cemetery, partially hidden behind a fallen tree. It was another metal box, identical to the one I'd found. I walked over and picked it up. It was lighter than the first one, and when I shook it, I could hear something rattling inside. I tried to open it, but like the first one, the lid was stuck. I carried it back to my cruiser and put it in the trunk. I drove back to the station and showed it to the detective. He opened it with a pry bar. Inside was another bundle of bones, arranged in the same pattern as the first, and another piece of paper with the same kind of nonsensical writing, but this time the date at the bottom was different. April 2003. The detective looked at me and asked where I'd found it. I told him. He asked if there were any more. I said I didn't know, but I could go back and check. He said no, he'd send someone from the crime scene unit to search the area properly. He told me to write up a report and let him handle it from there. I wrote the report and tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. A few days later, I asked the detective if the crime scene unit had found anything. He said yes. They'd found 6 more boxes, all in the same cemetery, all containing animal bones and papers, with dates ranging from 1987 to 2015. The detective said they were working with the university to try to understand what the boxes meant and who had put them there. I never heard any more about it. The investigation went cold, or maybe they just decided it wasn't worth pursuing. I don't know. What I do know is that about a month later, I was patrolling the same stretch of Route 421, and I saw another pickup, pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. I pulled in behind it, ran the plate, and got out to check on the driver. It was a different man, younger, driving a different truck. He said he'd pulled over because he'd heard something moving in the bed. I walked around to the back and looked. There was a metal box wedged between the bed and the cab. I didn't touch it. I went back to the driver and told him he was free to go, but he should probably have a mechanic check his truck for loose parts. He thanked me and drove off. I stood there on the shoulder, looking at the empty space where his truck had been, and I made a decision. I don't stop for vehicles on that stretch of road anymore. I drive past and radio it in, let someone else handle it. I don't care if it makes me look like I'm shirking my duty. I don't care if the other deputies think I'm scared or superstitious. I know what I saw. I know those boxes keep appearing, keep ending up in the backs of trucks driven by people who have no idea what they're carrying. I know that cemetery is still out there with whatever else might be buried in it, and I want no part of it. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving that road, I think about the dates on those papers. 1987, 2003, 2015. And I think about the fact that it's been a few years since the last one was dated. I think about what that might mean, and I tell myself it doesn't matter. It's not my problem anymore. But I still drive a little faster when I pass that cemetery. And I still don't stop for anyone on that stretch of road no matter what. The call about the abandoned cruiser came in just after midnight, and I knew before I even responded that it was going to be another one of those nights. I'd been working as a state trooper in eastern Kentucky for about 7 years, mostly highway patrol along I-75 and the smaller state routes that branch off into the mountains. The job had patterns you learned to recognize: drunk drivers on Friday nights, accidents during morning commutes, domestics on holidays. But there was another pattern, one that didn't appear in any training manual, one that only the troopers who'd worked these mountains for years really understood. The dispatcher said a motorist had called in about a state police cruiser sitting on the shoulder of Route 30, about 15 miles south of Hazard. The vehicle had been there for over an hour with its lights on, but no one was inside. The motorist had stopped to check, found the cruiser empty, and called it in. Dispatch had tried raising the trooper assigned to that vehicle on the radio. No response. I was the closest unit, about 20 minutes away. I acknowledged the call and headed that way. Route 30 is one of those roads that seems designed to make you uneasy. It follows a creek for most of its length, winding through a valley so narrow that the sun only hits the road for a few hours each day. The forest presses in close on both sides, and there are long stretches where you won't see a house or even a mailbox for miles. I found the cruiser right where the motorist had described it, pulled onto a gravel turnout on the south side of the road. It was one of our newer vehicles, the light still flashing, the engine running. I pulled in behind it and sat there for a moment, looking at it. Something about the scene felt wrong. The door was closed. The computer was still on. Everything looked normal, except there was no trooper. I radioed dispatch and confirmed I was on scene. They asked if I saw the trooper. I said no. Vehicle appeared abandoned. They asked me to check it. I got out and approached the cruiser, my hand instinctively moving toward my belt. I looked through the driver's window. The vehicle was empty. The computer screen showed the last call the trooper had run. A plate check from about 2 hours ago. There was a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, still warm. A clipboard with a half-finished report sat on the passenger seat. I tried the door, unlocked. I opened it and looked inside more, carefully. The keys were in the ignition. The radio was on, volume up. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate anything violent had happened. The trooper's portable radio was on the dash. His hat was on the back seat. I checked the trunk. His rifle was still secured in its rack. I checked the computer, looked at the recent activity. The last entry was the plate check, logged at 10:47 p.m. It was now 12:23 a.m. I radioed dispatch and told them what I was seeing. They asked if there were any signs of where the trooper might have gone. I walked around the cruiser, checking the ground with my flashlight. The gravel was disturbed where the vehicle had pulled in, but I couldn't make out any distinct footprints. I walked to the edge of the tree line and shined my light into the woods. Nothing. I called out, identifying myself. My voice echoed slightly in the narrow valley, then was swallowed by the sound of the creek. Dispatch said they were sending more units. They asked me to wait and secure the scene. I went back to my cruiser and pulled out a flare, set it up behind the abandoned vehicle. Then I stood there in the flashing lights, trying to piece together what might have happened. There were a few possibilities, none of them good. The trooper could have responded to something he saw in the woods and gone to investigate without radioing it in. That would be against protocol, but it happened. He could have had a medical emergency and wandered off in confusion. He could have been pulled from his vehicle by someone or something. Or he could have left the vehicle deliberately, for reasons I didn't want to speculate about. I knew the trooper who'd been assigned this vehicle. His name was Mitchell, a guy in his early 30s who transferred to this post about a year ago. He was quiet, competent, didn't cause problems. We'd worked together a few times. He didn't seem like the type to abandon his post. The first backup unit arrived about 15 minutes later. It was another trooper from my post, a guy named Garrett who'd been with the department for over 20 years. He got out and walked over to me, looked at the abandoned cruiser, then at the dark woods, then back at me. He asked what I thought happened. I said I didn't know. He nodded slowly and said, "This was the third one." I asked him what he meant. He said this was the third time in the last 8 years that a cruiser had been found abandoned on this stretch of Route 30. The first time was in 2008. Trooper pulled over to check on what he thought was a stranded motorist, radioed it in, then went silent. They found his cruiser about 6 miles from here, engine running, lights on, empty. They searched for 3 days, brought in dogs and helicopters. Found him on the 4th day, about 2 miles into the woods, sitting against a tree. He was alive but unresponsive, couldn't or wouldn't explain what had happened. He never came back to work. Took early retirement on medical grounds. The second time was in 2013. Female trooper, similar situation. Found her cruiser near the same spot where Mitchell's was now. She was found the next morning, walking along the highway about 10 miles south, covered in scratches and mud. She said she'd been following someone into the woods, thought they were injured and needed help. She said she'd walked for what felt like hours, but when she tried to turn back, she couldn't find the road. She said the forest kept changing around her, that paths she'd just walked down would disappear when she tried to retrace them. She transferred to another post the next month. Garrett said there was something about this stretch of road that didn't work right. He said troopers who patrolled it regularly reported feeling like they were being watched, like there were eyes in the woods that tracked them as they drove past. He said there had been other incidents over the years. Vehicles that wouldn't start for no mechanical reason. Radios that would pick up strange sounds. Headlights that would catch movement in the trees that didn't match any animal they knew. I asked him if he believed it. He said it didn't matter what he believed. The evidence was there. 3 troopers, same area, same circumstances. He said we'd probably find Mitchell by morning, just like the others. He said the question wasn't where he was, but what he'd say when we found him. More units arrived. They brought dogs. We organized a search, started working our way into the woods from the cruiser, spreading out in a line, calling Mitchell's name. The dogs seemed hesitant, pulling at their leads, whining. One of them refused to go more than 50 feet into the trees, just sat down and wouldn't move. The handler said that wasn't normal. We searched for 4 hours, covering maybe a square mile of forest. The dogs didn't hit on anything. We didn't find any tracks, any signs of recent passage, anything to indicate Mitchell had gone into these woods. Around 4 in the morning, the sergeant called off the search until daylight. He said we'd resume at dawn with more personnel and helicopters. I was assigned to stay with the abandoned cruiser until the recovery team could tow it back to the post. The other troopers left. I sat in my cruiser, parked behind Mitchell's, watching the woods as the night slowly gave way to early morning. The flashing lights painted the trees in blue and red, creating shadows that moved and shifted. Around 5:30, just as the sky was starting to lighten, I saw something. Movement in the tree line, about 40 yards ahead. I got out and shined my spotlight on the area. Mitchell was standing there, just inside the woods, facing the road. He was still in uniform, but his shirt was untucked and his duty belt was missing. He was just standing there, not moving. I called out to him. He didn't respond. I started walking toward him, my hand on my weapon, calling his name. As I got closer, I could see his face. His expression was blank, his eyes unfocused. I asked if he was all right. He didn't answer. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and he suddenly focused on me, his eyes sharp and clear. He said he was sorry. I asked him what happened. He said he'd seen something on the road, thought it was a deer that had been hit. He'd pulled over to check on it, got out of his cruiser and walked toward it. But when he got close, it wasn't a deer. He said he couldn't explain what it was, just that it was wrong. He said it had moved into the woods and he'd followed it, thinking maybe it was an injured person or an animal in distress. He said he'd walked for maybe 5 minutes, and then he couldn't find the road anymore. I asked him how long he'd been in the woods. He said maybe an hour. I told him it had been over 6 hours. He looked at me like I was lying, then looked down at his watch. His expression changed. He said that wasn't possible. He said it had only been an hour at most. I radioed that I'd found him. The sergeant said to bring him in. They'd have a medic check him out. I walked Mitchell back to my cruiser. He kept looking back at the woods, his face showing something between fear and confusion. I asked him about his duty belt. He said he didn't know. He said he'd had it when he went into the woods, but at some point he'd realized it was gone and he couldn't remember taking it off. We searched the area where I'd found him. We found his duty belt hanging from a tree branch about 20 feet into the woods. All his equipment was still attached. His weapon, radio, flashlight, everything. It was hanging at chest height, like someone had carefully placed it there. Mitchell looked at it and shook his head. He said he didn't do that. He said he wouldn't have taken off his belt, and he definitely wouldn't have hung it on a tree. I drove him back to the post. The medic checked him over. No injuries, no signs of exposure or trauma. Just some scratches on his hands and face from branches. The sergeant interviewed him for over an hour. Mitchell told the same story, consistently and clearly. He'd seen something on the road, followed it into the woods, walked for what he thought was an hour but was actually 6 hours, and couldn't explain any of it. The sergeant sent him home and told him to take a few days off. I heard later that Mitchell requested a transfer to another post. The request was granted. He's working highway patrol near Lexington now, nowhere near the mountains. I stopped patrolling Route 30 as much as I could after that. When I have to drive it, I keep my windows up and I don't stop for anything unless dispatch specifically directs me to. I've seen things on that road at night, shapes that move at the edge of my headlights, shadows that seem to pace the cruiser as I drive past. I tell myself it's deer or other wildlife, that the mind plays tricks in the dark, that there's a logical explanation. But I think about Mitchell, standing in those woods for 6 hours that felt like one, and I think about his duty belt hanging from that tree. And I think about the 2 other troopers who'd gone into those same woods and come back changed. I think about what Garrett said, that something about this stretch of road doesn't work right. I don't know what's in those woods. I don't know what Mitchell followed into them, or what happened to him during those lost hours. What I know is that when I drive Route 30 at night, I keep my speed up and my eyes on the road ahead. And if I see something that looks like it might be injured or in distress on the shoulder, I drive past it and radio it in for someone else to check. Some roads, some stretches of these mountains, they belong to something other than us. You learn to recognize them. You learn to leave them alone. The maintenance calls for that particular cell tower started the same week they assigned me to the Northern Patrol area, and by the time I understood what was happening, I'd already been up there 4 times. I was working as a deputy in a county that stretches across some of the most mountainous terrain in North Carolina, where the elevation changes so dramatically that you can leave the valley in sunshine and drive into a snowstorm at the ridgeline. Cell coverage was spotty at best, and the county had contracted with a telecommunications company to maintain a network of towers scattered across the high points. Part of my patrol duties involved checking on these towers, making sure the access roads were passable, watching for vandalism or copper thieves trying to strip the equipment. It wasn't glamorous work, but it got me out of the office and gave me a reason to cover territory most deputies avoided. The particular tower I'm talking about was on the highest point in the county, at the end of a Forest Service road that climbed for 6 miles through dense woodland. The tower itself sat in a cleared area about the size of a basketball court, surrounded by a chain-link fence with razor wire on top. The first call came in on a Tuesday afternoon. The telecommunications company reported that the tower was showing offline in their system. They asked if we could send someone up to check on it, see if there was obvious damage or if someone had tampered with the equipment. I was in the area, so I volunteered. The drive up the mountain took about 45 minutes, the road getting progressively rougher as I climbed. By the time I reached the tower, I was in 4-wheel drive, and the fog was thick enough that I could barely see 20 feet ahead. I parked outside the fence and got out. The tower rose into the fog, disappearing about halfway up. The compound looked undisturbed. The gate was locked, the fence intact. I walked the perimeter, checking for signs of forced entry or damage. Everything seemed fine. I used the key the company had provided and opened the gate, walked to the equipment building at the base of the tower. The door was locked. I opened it and looked inside. The equipment was running, lights blinking on the panels, everything apparently functional. I didn't know enough about the technical side to troubleshoot it, but from what I could see, nothing was obviously wrong. I took some photos and called the telecommunications company from my cell phone. Surprisingly, I had service. They walked me through checking a few things, asked me to describe what I was seeing. I did. They said it must have been a temporary glitch in their monitoring system, because according to what I was describing, the tower was working fine. I locked up and drove back down the mountain. I filed a brief report and didn't think much more about it. The second call came 3 days later. Same situation. Tower showing offline, company asking for someone to check on it. I drove up again, same fog, same locked gate, same functioning equipment. I called the company. They said the same thing, must be a monitoring glitch. I asked if they wanted to send a technician to look at it. They said they'd add it to the schedule, but it might be a few weeks, given how remote the location was. The third call came a week after that. By this point, I was getting annoyed. I drove up the mountain again, checked everything again, but this time something was different. When I opened the equipment building, there was a smell. It was faint but distinct, like something organic decomposing. I checked the corners of the building, looked for dead animals that might have gotten trapped inside. Nothing. The smell seemed to be coming from the ventilation system, the ducts that brought cool air to the equipment. I called the company and told them about it. They said ventilation problems could definitely affect the equipment and cause the offline readings. They said they'd prioritize getting a technician out there. I left and drove back down. The fourth call came only 2 days later. This time, I was starting to feel like something was deliberately pulling me back to that tower. I made the drive, opened the gate, approached the equipment building. The smell was stronger now, unmistakable. Something was dead somewhere, in or near this building. I searched more thoroughly this time, checking the area around the building, looking under the wooden platform it sat on. That's when I found the hatch. It was set into the ground underneath the platform. A metal access hatch, about 3 feet square, with a recessed handle. I pulled it open and immediately the smell hit me, stronger than before. I shined my flashlight down. There was a ladder descending into darkness. I called down, asked if anyone was there. My voice echoed slightly, then silence. I radioed dispatch and told them what I'd found. They asked what I wanted to do. I said I was going to check it out, see if there was a dead animal down there or something that explained the smell. They told me to be careful and stay on the radio. I climbed down the ladder. It descended about 15 feet into a small underground room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a dirt floor. The smell was overwhelming down here. I swept my flashlight around the room. There were electrical conduits running along the ceiling, presumably connecting to the tower equipment above. There was a workbench against one wall with some tools on it, and in the corner there was a sleeping bag. It looked relatively new, not the kind of thing that had been abandoned for years. I walked over to it and nudged it with my boot. Empty. I checked the rest of the room more carefully. There were food wrappers in another corner, empty water bottles, a camping stove. Someone had been living down here, or at least spending significant time here. I radioed dispatch and told them what I'd found. They asked if there was anyone down there now. I said no, but someone had clearly been using it as a shelter. They told me to come back up, and they'd send another unit to help me search the area. I started back toward the ladder, and that's when I heard the sound. It was coming from somewhere in the walls, a scraping noise like metal on concrete. I stopped and listened. The sound moved, traveling along the wall to my right, then stopping. I called out, identifying myself, saying if anyone was there, they needed to show themselves. The scraping started again, this time on the opposite wall. It sounded like it was inside the concrete, which didn't make sense. I climbed the ladder quickly, closed the hatch, and waited by my cruiser for backup. The other deputy arrived about 30 minutes later. We went back down into the room together, this time with better lights. We didn't hear the scraping sound. We searched more thoroughly, found more evidence of recent habitation. A journal with entries dated from the past month, more food supplies, a portable battery charger. The journal was interesting. The entries were short and cryptic, mostly just observations about the weather and notes about the tower equipment, but the last few entries were different. They talked about sounds in the walls, about feeling watched, about seeing shapes moving in the fog outside the compound. The last entry, dated 2 days ago, said, "They're in the walls now. Can't stay here anymore." We took the journal and the other items as evidence and sealed the hatch. We checked the area around the tower compound, looking for whoever had been living down there.
We found a trail leading into the woods, followed it for about half a mile until it petered out in dense underbrush. We called out, but got no response. Eventually, we gave up and drove back down the mountain. The sergeant had me file a report and send it to the Forest Service, since the incident happened on federal land. The Forest Service said they'd be aware of it and would send a ranger to check on the tower periodically. The telecommunications company sent a technician out the following week. He found the source of the smell, a dead raccoon that had gotten into the ventilation
system and died there. He cleaned it out and declared the equipment fully functional. I didn't get any more calls about that tower for about a month. Then the report started. A hiker found a tent about 2 miles from the tower, set up in a small clearing. Inside were supplies, a sleeping bag, and another journal. The entries described the same things. Sounds in the woods, shapes in the fog, a feeling of being constantly watched. The last entry said the writer was going to the tower because it was the only place with power and light. The Forest Service did a more extensive search. They found 2 more campsites in the area around the tower, both showing signs of recent use, both abandoned. They found sections of the trail that had been marked with symbols, carved into trees, arrows and crosses and shapes that didn't represent anything recognizable. They found more journals, all describing the same experiences, all ending with the decision to go to the tower. I was assigned to go back up and do a thorough check of the compound. I took another deputy with me. We searched the equipment building, checked the hatch, explored the underground room. Everything was as we'd left it, but when we came back up and were locking the hatch, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were scratches on the inside of the hatch cover, deep gouges in the metal, like someone had been trying to claw their way out from underneath. We checked the ladder. There were smears on the rungs, dark stains that looked like dried blood. We went back down into the room with a better light and examined the walls more carefully. There were scratches here too, dozens of them, clustered in certain areas, particularly around the corners where the walls met. Some of them were shallow, just surface marks. Others were deep, like someone had used a tool or worked at them for hours. We took photos and measurements. We collected samples of the stains from the ladder. We sealed the room and recommended that the hatch be permanently locked. The sergeant agreed. He also ordered that patrols of the tower be suspended until the Forest Service could complete their investigation. But the Forest Service never completed their investigation. They did a few more sweeps of the area, found 1 more abandoned campsite, and then their interest seemed to wane. The official position became that someone, possibly someone with mental health issues, had been living in the woods near the tower and had developed delusions about being watched or followed. The scratches in the journals were just evidence of their deteriorating mental state. The case was never formally closed, but it was never actively pursued either. I transferred to a different patrol area about a year later. I don't cover that territory anymore. I heard from another deputy that the tower had to be decommissioned last year due to repeated equipment failures. The telecommunications company couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. Technicians would fix it, test it, confirm it was working perfectly, and then, within a week, it would be offline again. Eventually, they just gave up and built a new tower on a different ridge. The old tower is still there as far as I know. The fence is still up. The hatch is still locked. I sometimes wonder if anyone else has found it, if anyone else has climbed down into that room and heard the sounds in the walls. I wonder if there are more journals out there in the woods, more campsites, more people who went to that tower looking for something and didn't find what they expected. I drive past the turnoff to that Forest Service road sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling the highways. I see the sign pointing up into the mountains, and I think about that clearing in the fog, the tower rising into the clouds, the scratches on the inside of the hatch. I think about the last entry in that first journal. They're in the walls now. I don't know what that means. I don't know who or what was in those walls, but I know I'm glad I don't patrol that area anymore. Someone else can answer the calls about that tower. Someone else can climb that mountain and unlock that hatch. I've done my time up there, and I have no desire to go back. The thing about these mountains is they hold on to their secrets. They hold on to their history, and sometimes they hold on to people too, in ways that don't show up in any report or investigation. You learn to recognize the places that don't want you there. You learn to leave them alone. That tower is one of those places. Whatever happened in that underground room, whatever was scratching at those walls, it's still there. And it's still waiting. The intersection where we kept finding the cars started appearing in my dispatch calls about once a month, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. I'd been working as a deputy in a county that covers the southeastern mountains of West Virginia for about 9 years at that point, long enough to know which calls were routine and which ones carried a weight you couldn't explain in a report. This particular intersection was where Route 16 crosses County Road 7 out past the old coal processing plant that shut down in the 90s. There's nothing out there now except forest and a few abandoned structures, and you can go weeks without seeing a vehicle pass through after dark. The pattern started in January. A motorist called 911 saying they'd almost hit a parked car sitting in the middle of the intersection with no lights on. By the time I got there, about 15 minutes later, the car was gone. The motorist was still there, a woman in her 40s, heading home from a late shift at the hospital. She described what she'd seen: a sedan, dark-colored, sitting right in the center of where the two roads cross. No lights, no driver visible. She'd swerved to avoid it and pulled over to call it in. She said when she'd looked back, the car had vanished. I checked the intersection, checked the shoulders, checked the small pull-offs on both roads. No car, no tire marks, nothing. I filed a report listing it as a possible motorist hallucination due to fatigue. The woman had been working a double shift. It seemed like the most reasonable explanation. 3 weeks later, another call. Different motorist, same intersection, same description. Dark sedan, no lights, sitting in the middle of the crossing. This caller was a truck driver heading south on Route 16. He said he'd had to brake hard to avoid hitting it. He said he stopped about 100 yards past the intersection and walked back to check on the vehicle, thinking maybe the driver needed help. When he got back to the intersection, the car was gone. I responded to that call too. Same result. No vehicle, no evidence, no explanation. The truck driver was adamant about what he'd seen. He said he'd been driving these roads for 20 years and he knew the difference between an actual car and something his tired brain had conjured up. I believed him, but I didn't have anything to put in my report except another sighting of a phantom vehicle. The calls kept coming. Different motorists, always the same intersection, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always the same description. Dark sedan, no lights, sitting motionless in the center of the crossing. And always, when someone stopped to investigate or called it in, the car would be gone by the time anyone else arrived. After the 6th call, the sergeant asked me to start spending part of my overnight shifts watching that intersection, see if I could catch whoever was doing this. He was convinced it was someone playing a prank, maybe teenagers who knew the timing of my patrol route and were positioning a car there, just long enough to freak out passing motorists before driving away. It was a theory that made sense, except for the fact that I'd never once seen tire tracks leading away from the intersection, never heard an engine starting, never seen headlights in the distance. I started parking on County Road 7, about a quarter mile from the intersection, with a clear view of where the roads crossed. I'd sit there for hours, watching, waiting. The intersection was well lit by a single street light that swayed slightly in the wind, casting moving shadows across the pavement. I'd watch those shadows, watch the empty roads, and try to stay alert despite the tedium. On the third night of my surveillance, I saw the car appear. I don't mean I saw it drive up. I mean one moment the intersection was empty, and the next moment the car was there, sitting in the center of the crossing exactly as described. It was a sedan, dark blue or black, older model, maybe from the 80s or 90s. No lights, no movement, just sitting there. I started my cruiser and drove toward it, my spotlight already on, illuminating the vehicle. As I got closer, I could see there was no one in the driver's seat. The car looked abandoned, but it was sitting perfectly, straight, not pulled to the side or at an angle like a breakdown. I pulled up behind it and got out, calling out to identify myself. No response. I approached the driver's side and looked through the window. The interior was empty. No personal items, no trash. The seats looked old and worn. I tried the door, locked. I walked around to the passenger side, also locked. I checked the plate. It was a West Virginia plate, but it was old, the format they used to use before they redesigned them in the early 2000s. I ran it on my computer. It came back as a plate that had been reported inactive since 1997. I radioed dispatch and gave them the information. They confirmed the plate was inactive, registered to a vehicle that had been reported as totaled in an accident in 1997. The owner was deceased. I radioed back and asked what they wanted me to do with the vehicle. They said to have it towed and they'd figure out the ownership issue later. I called for a tow truck. While I waited, I walked around the car again, checking for anything unusual. That's when I noticed the damage. The entire driver's side was crumpled, the kind of damage you get from a high-speed impact. The paint was scraped away, the metal bent inward, but the damage looked old, the exposed metal rusted, the bent panels coated with years of dirt and oxidation. This car had been wrecked a long time ago. The tow truck arrived about 40 minutes later. Same driver I'd used before, a guy who ran a garage in town. He got out and looked at the car, then at me. He asked where I'd found it. I said right here, sitting in the intersection. He walked around it, same as I had, looking at the damage. He said he'd towed this car before. He said he'd towed it in 1997, after an accident at this exact intersection. He said the driver had run a stop sign and been hit by a truck. The driver had died. The car had been totaled and sent to a salvage yard in Charleston. I asked him if he was sure it was the same car. He said yes. He remembered because it was one of the worst accidents he'd responded to. He said there was no way this car should be here. It should be crushed or dismantled or recycled by now. But here it was, sitting in the same spot where it had been hit 25 years ago. We stood there in the intersection, both of us looking at the car, trying to make sense of it. I checked the VIN plate on the dashboard. I radioed it to dispatch. They confirmed it matched the car that had been totaled in 1997. I asked the tow driver if he could still tow it. He said yes, but he didn't like it. He said something felt wrong about the whole situation. He hooked up the car and lifted it. As soon as the front wheels came off the ground, the street light above us went out. Just went dark, with a sound like a small pop. We both looked up at it, then at each other. He said he'd seen that light work fine for 20 years. I said, let's just get the car out of here. He towed it to the impound lot behind the sheriff's office. We documented everything, took photos, filled out the paperwork. The sergeant came out to look at it. He ran the VIN himself, confirmed it was the car from the 1997 accident. He called the salvage yard in Charleston. They said they had no record of what happened to the car after they'd processed it. They said it had probably been sold for parts or scrap, but their records from that far back were incomplete. The sergeant decided to hold the car as evidence of something, he wasn't sure what. Possible fraud, possible administrative error, possible something else we didn't have a name for. He told me to include everything in my report and to keep watching that intersection. I did. The next night, I parked in my usual spot and watched. Around 3 a.m, the car appeared again. Same car, same position, sitting in the middle of the intersection. Except this car was in the impound lot. I'd seen it there when I started my shift. I radioed dispatch and told them what I was seeing. They confirmed the car was still in the impound lot. The night supervisor went out and checked. The car was there, locked behind the fence. But I was looking at the same car sitting in the intersection. I drove up to it, got out, walked around it. Same damage, same plate, same empty interior. I tried the door, locked. I took photos. Then I got back in my cruiser and sat there, watching it. At 4:07 a.m., the car disappeared. One moment it was there, the next moment it was gone. No sound, no lights, just gone. I drove to the impound lot. The car was still there. I compared the photos I'd just taken to the car in the lot. They were identical. The sergeant called me into his office the next day. He said this was beyond anything he knew how to handle. He said we had a car that was simultaneously in the impound lot and appearing at an intersection. He said we had multiple witnesses, multiple deputies, including myself, and documentation that couldn't be explained. He said he was going to contact the state police and see if they had any ideas. The state police sent an investigator. He looked at everything, the reports, the photos, the car in the impound lot. He talked to the motorists who'd called in sightings. He talked to me. He spent a night watching the intersection himself. He saw the car appear at 2:47 a.m. and disappear at 4:03 a.m. He documented it all. His conclusion was that we were experiencing what he called a temporal echo, some kind of residual phenomenon related to the fatal accident in 1997. He said there were documented cases of similar events, where traumatic incidents seemed to imprint themselves on a location and replay under certain conditions. He said there was no criminal activity, no fraud, no rational explanation that fit standard investigative frameworks. He recommended we note the phenomenon in our records and otherwise disregard it. The sergeant wasn't happy with that conclusion, but he didn't have a better one. He ordered me to stop actively investigating the intersection and return to normal patrol duties. He said if anyone called about the car, we'd send someone to look, document it, and move on. He said the car in the impound lot would be released to the salvage yard and they could do whatever they wanted with it. But the car never left the impound lot. The salvage yard sent a flatbed to pick it up. But when the driver went to load it, he refused. He said the car made him feel sick. Said he had an overwhelming sense of dread being near it. He left without it. The salvage yard never sent anyone else. The car just sat there in the impound lot, slowly accumulating dust and pollen, and it kept appearing at the intersection, once or twice a month, always between 2 and 4 a.m. always in the exact same position. We stopped responding to calls about it. Motorists would call it in, we'd note it in the log, but we wouldn't send anyone out. The calls became less frequent as word spread that the car was a known phenomenon, something that appeared and vanished on its own schedule. I transferred to the Southern District about a year after all this started. I don't patrol that area anymore. I heard from another deputy that the car in the impound lot finally disappeared a few months ago. One day it was there, the next day it was gone. No one had moved it. No one had authorized its removal. It was just gone. But the car still appears at the intersection. I know because I still get calls about it sometimes, forwarded from dispatch when they need someone familiar with the history. I always tell them the same thing: document it and move on. There's nothing anyone can do about it. It's been there since 1997, since the night someone ran a stop sign and died in the middle of that crossing. It's still there now, repeating that moment over and over, visible to anyone who happens to be passing by at the right time. I've thought a lot about that driver over the years, whoever they were, whatever they were thinking in the moment before the truck hit them. I wonder if they knew, in that last second, that they were about to become part of that intersection forever, that their last moment would keep replaying for decades, visible to strangers driving past in the middle of the night. These mountains hold on to things. They hold on to history, onto tragedy, onto the moments when something goes terribly wrong. That intersection is one of those places. The car will keep appearing there, and people will keep seeing it. And there's nothing anyone can do except drive past and try not to think too hard about what it means when a place won't let go of its dead.